So it turns out economists actually can't save lives, but we get to know people who save lives, and it's very nice to do so. And 25 years ago, when I first started talking to medical audiences about kidneys, I always had to begin by explaining, why are you listening to an economist today? And part of the story is that economics is concerned with how to allocate scarce resources efficiently and equitably, but it's also concerned with how to make scarce resources less scarce. And so kidney exchange is a natural kind of endeavor to engage in for those reasons. And market design is the part of economics that really gets into the details. And what that means is, over the course of my experience as a market designer, I often find myself, as I am today, giving a talk to an audience that knows much more about what I'm going to talk about than I do. So I hope you'll bear with me. I'm an economist. I have a necessarily sort of American perspective, but I'm going to recapitulate a little what we've heard today and tell you how it looks through my eyes. Okay, so we already know that per million population there's a big diversity, but that some of the countries that don't yet have high transplantation per million population are very big, and therefore account for a lot of the transplants in the world. And just looking at those two graphs together, what you can see is that if in India we can get the rate of transplantation up not all that much higher, then most of the kidney transplants in the world will start happening in India. So it's certainly something to think about and to work towards. Now, in both those pictures, the U.S. looks like we're doing well, but we're not doing well. We have 130,000 new kidney failure cases a year in the U.S., and more than 500,000 people on dialysis, but we only do around 21,000 deceased donor transplants per year and another almost 7,000, I think, living donors. So we're not close, right? We have lots of patients who need transplants and who will die without getting them, okay? And this is just kidneys. So everyone, this is a worldwide problem. Everyone needs to work on it. In May, the WHO noticed this officially. I mean, I'm sure they'd noticed it before, but this is a worldwide problem. We're all in this together. So you all know what kidney exchange is, and one of the things we've talked about is how doing just two pairs makes you want to do them simultaneously, which means it's going to be hard to scale because of all the demands on operating rooms, right? So here's a picture from 2006. Mike isn't in the picture, but he's on the phone. He's the other half of this transplant. This is half of a two-way exchange. I'm the man in the yellow gown, keeping out of the way. It's a simultaneous exchange. The man in the tiger skin cap is Dr. Woodle. Before they took the kidney, which is sitting in the dish in front of him, he got on the phone from the OR and called up Mike in Toledo, Ohio, different city nearby, and said, we're ready to go here. We've successfully anesthetized the patients and we've made the initial incisions. Are you also ready to go? And when Mike said he was ready to go, they did the nephrectomies and the transplant. So that means 4 simultaneous operating rooms had to be available, 4 surgical teams had to be available. You can see that trying to scale it up to a country the size of the United States, that was going to be hard. Not long after, we got to be able to do 3-way exchanges in 6 operating rooms at a time. I was living in New England at the time, and there were 14 transplant centers in Region 1, in the New England region. Half a dozen of them were in Manhattan. So there were transplant centers close to each other. Donors traveled at that moment. All the things we've heard about. Okay, but pretty soon we figured out that it was going to be helpful to do non-simultaneous chains. And again, you all know the reasons. Let me just remind you, let's take a look at the 2-way exchange on the left and imagine that we did that non-simultaneously, which we almost never do. So that on day 1, donor 2 successfully gives a kidney to recipient 1. And on day 2, for whatever reason, donor 1 fails to give a kidney to recipient 2. That's a really bad outcome for pair 2 because they've given a kidney and haven't gotten one, so they've had a surgery that didn't help them, a major surgery, a nephrectomy. but also they don't have a kidney anymore to take part in kidney exchange. When we run the next kidney exchange match run, they can't participate because their kidney is gone. So we try never to do that. But when we have a non-directed donor, all of a sudden that changes, right? So here's a picture with the non-directed donor, and on day 1, supposing it's non-simultaneous, he gives to recipient 1, and on day 2, for whatever reason, donor 1 doesn't continue the chain. Well, that's disappointing. But as Dr. Furian said just moments ago, it's not tragic. Pair 2 is no worse off than they were before the non-directed donor appeared, and they still have a kidney. They can take part in kidney exchange tomorrow, right? So the costs of a broken link are much less, and that allows us to start thinking about non-simultaneous chains. And we first thought about that in a paper on simultaneous chains, but in New England, our surgical colleagues were reluctant to do it for fear of that broken chains would get bad publicity. And so the surgeon who went ahead and did it is Mike. And here's I believe this is the first non-simultaneous chain that was reported. And non-simultaneous chains can be long, and that's part of their benefit. But another part of their benefit is they allow you to reach highly sensitized patients. So I want to talk a little more about that because it's easy to see that if they're long, that's a good thing. You know, we get lots of transplants initiated by this non-directed donor. But it's a better thing even than that. And incidentally, chains play a giant role in American kidney exchange. Right? And we have several hundred non-directed donors a year. So we're a big country. We have a lot of we have a noticeable number of non-directed donors. It's small compared to the total number of donations, but they have an outsized effect on the number of transplants we can do through the kidney exchange pool. Okay, so here at the top is the picture that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine article in 2009. Incidentally, that's a chain. The dates are on top. That chain went from as reported in this article, it went from July 2007 to March 2008. Right. So this was a leisurely chain. It wasn't ended here. The picture below is in People magazine, where many of the people in the chain stepped out from behind their HIPAA privacy protections and allowed their names to be used. And this was a first chain, and it had what I think we might characterize as a mistake in it, which is we paused it with an AB donor. Okay, so the last donor is Helena McKinney, and she was blood type AB, but it's hard to find AB recipients in the kidney exchange pool with whom she could be compatible, because although they don't have a blood type barrier, they don't have a blood type incompatibility with their intended donor either. So these are people who have some other difficulty in getting a kidney. They're highly sensitized often. And so it took, Mike is here somewhere, and 3 years? Okay, it took 3 years. She added another 12 people to the picture. Okay? But nowadays, and there was a question about this just a moment ago, if we were going to pause the chain there, we would ask her to give to somebody on the deceased donor waiting list, and 4% of Americans have blood type AB, so there's never a problem giving to someone on the deceased donor waiting list if you have blood type AB. But chains can be long, but they also can get to people who are highly sensitized. So let me talk about that a little bit, because I think many of the things I was going to say to you, and have intended that they should be recapitulation, I'm going to go over very quickly because you've already heard them and you know them better than I do anyway. But I thought that this is a point that that maybe isn't so obvious and wasn't emphasized so much in the previous talks. So here's a visual excuse me. Here's a visualization of a piece of Mike's data set at the APKD from some time ago. So let me tell you about it. It's a compatibility graph. It's a lot like the compatibility network that Alex showed you, except the arrows are reversed. So every circle in this picture is a patient-donor pair, and an arrow goes from one pair to another if the kidney can go from the first pair to the next pair. And everyone in this pair, all the patients and all the donors, have blood type A. So there are no blood type incompatibilities in this data snapshot. Nevertheless, what you see in blue is there's only a small number of patients who have a lot of arrows going into their circle. These are the low sensitized pairs. Incidentally, among the low sensitized pairs who you could have are compatible pairs, right? Because there's some selection going on there. If you can take a kidney from your sister, then maybe you can take kidneys from lots of people. And so we could easily match the easy-to-match pairs to one another in pairwise exchanges, and that would be a waste, right? Because the way you're going to match the hard-to-match pairs is by matching them to other pairs, and in particular to easy-to-match pairs. So let's think about where a chain comes from. Supposing each of us represents a hard-to-match pair that has a very highly sensitized patient in it. So all of us patients are highly sensitized. The chance that my pair can give your pair a kidney is very small because you guys are highly sensitized. In a moderate-sized room like this, the chance that my pair can give some pair a kidney is not so small because there are many pairs in the room. But in a big room with lots of pairs, with hundreds of pairs, it would start to be a pretty good chance that my pair could give a kidney to some pair. What's the chance they can give a kidney back to us? Well, it's very small because we're highly sensitized. But in a big enough room, in a big enough pool of patient-donor pairs, the chance that they can give a kidney to someone else is not so small. And the chance that they can give a kidney to someone else is not so small. And so now we're building the chain. And when we do a match run in a kidney exchange data set of patient-donor pairs, typically we, under our criteria, and I'll tell you more about the algorithms, we go until there are no more matches. So the remaining patients who don't have a match when we finish the match run, some of them are forming a chain, okay? And if a non-directed donor comes along, they can ignite that chain, right? Because it doesn't have to come back to the non-directed donor. So a non-directed donor who comes into a data set like this can talk about a chain that may go through many people and end with a donation to the waiting list. Okay? So one of the inputs into a matching algorithm will be the compatibility graph. Okay? How do we decide? How do you decide, you physicians, who's compatible with whom? Which kidneys are acceptable for the patient in this pair? Okay? So that's one of the inputs, and that can have many factors in it already. You might decide people are incompatible for reasons of age. I mean, obviously, cross-match and all of that. But you might decide they're incompatible for reasons of distance. You might decide that there's a lot of flexibility in building this compatibility matrix. And of course, if we were doing livers instead of kidneys, then size would become much more important. And we'd typically be looking not just at blood type A patients and donors. We'd be looking at some big set that also had blood type incompatibilities. So that's one part of where you can start to do mathematics on this network and start to look for chains and cycles. Okay, so this is a picture of what's called an integer program. I'm not going to tell you too much about that, just as for various reasons. But notice what it does is it maximizes a weighted number of transplants. So think about this picture. Every line, every arrow represents a possible transplant, a transplant that could be done between a donor and a compatible recipient. Each of those lines can be assigned a weight. And now what you're looking for is a matching, which is a chain or a cycle that has the property that no kidney is transplanted more than once, and has some other properties. You know, you want to make sure that, it works on the pairs. You want to make sure that every pair that gives a kidney gets a kidney. But you can put weights on each of these lines. And the weights can express your clinical judgment, your political judgment, all the judgments that go into how good a transplant is this one. Okay? And what you're trying to do is you're trying to find a collection of transplants that constitute a match and that satisfy some constraints. You can also add lots of constraints. If you have lots of constraints, you can start to filter which cycles you'll allow, which chains you'll allow. And you're looking for one that has the maximum sum weight, right? So you're asking the integer program to make some trade-offs for you that you've instructed it by giving it weights on transplants. Now, one of the things I heard mentioned, I think by Itai, is we need experiments. In other words, these weights are not, the weights on the integer program are not on the patient's charts. They're not medical facts. They're intuitions about how to combine different quality transplants together into a match, which is the set of all the transplants you're going to do at any given moment, the chain or the cycle. Okay? And I think in any sensible program, especially being tried in a different country than it's been used before, things like that, it's going to be important to experiment on the weights and on the constraints. Those are things that partly you'll learn from experience. That is, maybe it's hard to transport kidneys from one particular Indian state to another particular Indian state, while it's easy to transport from others. You know, what are the commercial airline schedules, things like that. So those are things that are not on the patient's charts, but are still important to figure out what they are. And but a structure like this is very flexible, right? So you need the compatibility graph, which is going to be different if you're talking about livers than if you're talking about kidneys, and there's a lot of thought that has to go into how to construct that. And then there's this bit of optimization. And I should mention, just incidentally, that different publication cultures have different customs. And I understand that in medicine, I can infer a lot from the order of the authors. But in economics, we're in alphabetical order. And so the main author here is Itai. And you know, we all know it, and now you know it. So he knows more about putting together all these things than I think anyone else in the world. And of course, it goes into this software, which does many, many other things, as Mike indicated, right? It's not, this is a piece of the APKD software. But then there's all the other pieces about how to make it easy to put the data in and take it out and compare with patients at other centers and preserve privacy. So the suite of softwares that the APKD has this in it as an element, but a lot of experience has gone into constructing that suite of software. Okay, so then we've now heard about deceased donor chains. And remember, chains are really important. So deceased donor chains are chains. And that's part of the charm. And that's what Dr. Furian figured out before she consulted the literature. This is from one of her slides from an early stage. It's really wonderful that you got this going in Italy. You know, that lends a lot of credibility to these crazy ideas about starting chains with deceased donors. And in the US, one of the obstacles to that is that there's this whole regulatory bureaucracy governing deceased donor allocation, whereas kidney exchange, living donors, is sort of the Wild West. The donor has complete control of the kidney. So there's not the same kind of regulatory apparatus about deciding who gives a chain. We can decide it with a computer algorithm, but there are rules and regulations deciding who gets a particular deceased donor kidney, and so we need to learn to deal with our regulators, as you will have to learn to deal with your regulators, and that's an important part of the design of this kind of allocation system. Okay, and you know, we now, as Mike and the gang have told you, we now have deceased donor chains in the US as well. Okay, so let's think about India a little bit. And again, you know, I apologize for being an American and not knowing, therefore, what I'm talking about in terms of context. But Dr. Kute has, of course, you know, shown that you don't need non-directed donors, which he's not able to access. You don't need non-directed donors in order to get long exchanges that can get some highly sensitized people. So he's been talking to us about non-simultaneous cycles. And you know, he already talked about that, but what I want to point out to you is this is not a chain, it's a cycle, right? He doesn't have access to non-directed donors, but he still has, you know, 10 pairs in the picture. And of course, it takes him a lot of thought to make sure that if there's a breach in the chain, he can recover. So the dark, as if I understand this figure properly, the dark ones are people who are going to wait, who are going to donate a kidney and then wait, and they're not the patients aren't highly sensitized, and so there's a way to repair the chain if it's not a chain, sorry, if it becomes a chain. There's a way to repair the planned exchange, and precisely this story about being non-anonymous is, my understanding is he gets everyone to buy in. It's not, when we talk about anonymity in the US, what we're mostly saying is you don't know who your donor is, and you don't know who if you're a pair, and you don't know who you're donating to. But these people have to all know each other. The people at the beginning have to know the people throughout. Is that a fair statement? So the non-anonymity that they employ in Gujarat is a much more profound non-anonymity than we might get if people happen to meet in the hospital and find out who's donating to whom in the next stage. Okay, so also I got a chance to watch Dr. Modi using his Da Vinci robot in India. When we think about where things can go, we have to think also about where equipment is going to go. I already mentioned to him that one thing I remember is that when I walked into the room, he got up and shook my hand, and neither of us was wearing gloves. And of course, he's not in the sterile field. I mean, the patient is very close, just off the picture, but he could be far away. If we had really good internet connections, then he wouldn't have to be in the same room as the patient and the surgeons who are attending to the patient, right? So when we start to think about possibilities and we talk about, donor travel and shipping kidneys, and Lucretia talked about surgeon travel, there are going to be more possibilities, and that's also something to think about. So let's think a little bit. Let's think a little bit about the future, and part of the future is getting more kidney exchange in India. Okay, and congratulations to Vivek and his colleagues. He already showed this paper from June 2025, but just this month in the Times of India, they had a news story that read the paper and noticed that a whole lot of transplants were happening in Gujarat. So that's really, that's exciting news. Lots of transplants in Gujarat. But remember, we've already talked about this, that most of the recipients are men. Now, here I'm really stepping out beyond what I reliably know about Indian transplantation, but because there's this emphasis, although it's not a strict legal emphasis, on immediate family being the donors, that's got to work against women, because women get sensitized to paternal antigens when they give birth. So kidney exchange is going to, I hope, make it easier for women to get transplants in India also. Okay, I think I say that somewhere. Yeah, here we go. Right. So expanding kidney transplants, one of its beyond immediate family, which kidney exchange does, one of its effects might be to make more transplants available to women. The other thing that we've heard from various of the speakers is that there's a high infection rate in India. When you do desensitization, you have to use a lot of immunosuppressive drugs. When you send people home, there are endemic diseases that give them infections that can be life-threatening, and certainly graft-threatening. So it's particularly important to do kidney exchange in India. And of course, India is particularly well suited to do kidney exchange because, if you remember back to those early slides and other things we've heard of, is almost all kidney transplantation in India is living donor. So they're already, a giant of living donor kidney transplantation. This will enhance that, will make it more powerful. Okay, and there'll be better graft survival if patients aren't coming down with infections so much. So it's really good news too. I said it was good news. It was delightful to hear what Italy was doing with deceased donor chains. It's really delightful to hear that India is thinking of expanding the scale, because India is a really big country, but you don't get the benefits of scale if each hospital is doing its own kidney exchange among their own patients. to get the benefits of scale, you need to have a national kidney exchange. Okay, because size matters, right? And kidney exchange works best with a large pool of patient donor pairs so that you can take care of those hard to match pairs, and there are many hard to match pairs. Okay, so one way that countries have tried to get larger pools is by doing international exchanges. So here's an exchange. I went with Mike Reese, he's in the picture there, to the UAE for the first kidney exchange between the UAE and Israel. But the UAE and Israel each have only 10 million population. So it helps them, it helps their patients if they can pool their patient donor pairs. But together they're only 20 million. And Israel, being only 10 million population, has also done exchanges with the Czech Republic. And they're also two countries of 10 million. So one of the things I think we can imagine after kidney exchange becomes well established in India, and I'll talk about Brazil too, is that they could start to become a place where patient donor pairs can go in order to get possible exchanges with lots of other patient donor pairs. And first-rate medical care is also much cheaper in India than in the United States, for example. So that will make kidney exchange much more accessible to people who live in small countries or in countries that, for whatever reason, don't have lots of kidney exchange. Okay, so when you look at this picture of how many transplants you got, there are countries like Israel and Czechoslovakia getting a few extra transplants by pooling their patient donor pairs. But one can imagine, getting a national transplant system in India first is the first priority. But you could imagine that once it's there, once most of the kidney transplants are happening in India, people will be able to come to India, and that will expand the pool even more and be good for India because, as big as the United States is, we have patients so highly sensitized that we have trouble finding them exchange transplants. I'm guessing that as big as India is, you'll have patients so highly sensitized that you won't be able to find them transplants either. But if the whole world comes, that will make it much bigger. Okay, and indeed, there have been international exchanges. Here's a paper by Dr. Kute and Dr. Modi and some others where they brought a pair, an Indian heritage pair from Portugal, because everyone was highly sensitized. So presumably, when it comes time to get the regulators' permission, they'll be able to do it. Okay, so that's looking pretty far into the future, right? There's a lot of steps between now and getting a really national kidney exchange program, a one nation, one swap program, but it's going to be worth it. So let me turn to Brazil, and here's a paper by Dr. Bastos and Dr. Ferreira and many of their colleagues that looks at the countries by population and whether they have kidney exchange or not. And I'm going to look in South America at the biggest, Brazil, and the smallest, Uruguay. Uruguay is so small that I think, except on your slide, Juliana, the others who talked about South America didn't even have Uruguay. I mean, it's got a population of 3 million, I think. But remember, Brazil, unlike India, is a place where most of the transplants are deceased donor. So Brazil is going to be a place where deceased donor-initiated chains have a real possibility of jump-starting kidney exchange. And to give you an idea of how that might work in an international way, not that we should start that way. We should start with national kidney exchange in Brazil, get the laws written properly. But once it's going, consider a hard-to-match pair in Uruguay. Uruguay has a population of 3 million, and Brazil is more than 60 times as big. So, and in 2024, Uruguay just had 67 deceased donors. So if you are a hard-to-match patient in Uruguay, you are not going to, you're going to die on dialysis, right? Because there just aren't enough deceased donors, and they are too small for kidney exchange. Whereas Brazil had 56 times as many deceased donors. So you could imagine a patient-donor pair from Uruguay, a patient and his intended donor, coming to Brazil, getting the initial deceased donor transplant that gets through all his complicated antibodies, so it's compatible with him, and then passing it forward as a chain in Brazil. By then, of course, you'll also have gotten the regulators to let you have non-directed donors. But even if not, in Italy, the deceased donors are the non-directed donors. So again, a very high PRA person, by coming to a big country like Brazil that does a lot of deceased donor transplants, would have much better chance of getting a transplant than if they had to rely on Uruguay's deceased donor pool. So again, these are things in the far future, right? The first thing is to get robust national kidney exchange going at a national scale in India and Brazil, but it's going to be worth doing. It's going to be worth waiting for. And here's the history of American kidney exchange in the transplants we've done and the non-directed donors. So the non-directed donors start chains, and what you see is we got off to a really slow start, right? So it could take a while, but once we got non-directed donor chains, it started to really take off. Non-simultaneous non-directed donor chains, Mike's contribution. So these things are going to be worth doing. Some of them we'll have to wait for, but it looks to me like this is a good path. I'm very encouraged to hear what's going on in all these places, and I want to thank all of you for doing this. Thank you.